Okay, well, I hope everybody's doing well. I had originally planned on getting this video posted yesterday on Thursday, but as it turns out, my voice wasn't all the way back yesterday. As you can hear, it still really isn't all the way back. And so I apologize for having to wheeze through this video and do things this way. It was never my intention, but this last Tuesday, my voice was completely gone. I was not even able to hardly even whisper. Well, anyhow, we've got today for sort of the last topic of this semester. Today we're going to be discussing the field of ethics. Now, because this is on the video rather than in class, what I find is that video lectures tend to go a lot faster than in class because there's not that sort of that interplay, the question answer, clarification, that sort of thing. So the way I'm going to handle this is this video will not be nearly as long. However, there will be a lot of information packed in the video such that I would recommend taking notes on it. In fact, I'm going to have you post the notes that you do take. You can either upload those from a word processor. You can write it down by hand and take pictures of it and upload it as well. That's another way you could do it. But I'm going to have you upload those to Blackboard so that I can see that you're taking notes on the topics and everything. But you may have to go back and listen to it a couple times. I don't know. That depends on how fast you can take notes, how fast comprehension takes place, and everything else. But so don't forget, after you listen to this video and take good notes on it, I do want you to upload those notes via Blackboard. I will create a portal there for you to do that, and then that will be for score as well, for points. So don't forget to do that. Okay, as I said before, we're talking about ethics today. And ethics is basically a branch of philosophy that deals with what we should do. What we should do. Now, this is different than any of the other fields that we've looked at thus far. We've looked at logic, which deals with what are the kind of laws in the universe and how logic and grammar and basically how truth can be figured out by just simply looking at laws of logic and so forth. It's basically the way the universe operates. We've looked at metaphysics, which, as we said before, is the study of being, the study of existence. Deal with questions like, does God exist? And are human choices free? And then we've also dealt with epistemology, which is the study of knowledge and what you can know. But if you look at all three of those branches of philosophy, logic, metaphysics, and epistemology, one thing that you'll notice is that they are descriptive in nature. In other words, they attempt to describe how the universe works, what's true about the world that we live in, what's true about the way that we think, and so forth. They are descriptive. On the other hand, ethics is unique among the fields of philosophy in that it doesn't so much attempt to describe what things are like, it's not descriptive so much, as it is prescriptive. In other words, it tells you how things ought to be, how things should be. So whereas these other fields that we've looked at so far are descriptive, ethics is a field that is prescriptive. Because of that, that's why we sort of save ethics for last. Because what you believe and what you've already determined in other areas of philosophy, those decisions, those assumptions are going to dramatically affect how you are able to think in the field of ethics. For example, how would the questions that are asked in metaphysics change or affect the way that you deal with ethics? Think about this. The question of whether or not God exists. How is a person who believes in the existence of God, how is the way that they formulate ethics going to be different than a person who doesn't believe in the existence of God? Clearly, you're going to have two very different ways of approaching ethics based on what the answer to that metaphysical question. Or Think about how you would answer the question, are human choices freely made? Are human choices freely made? If human choices are not freely made but are determined, well then our responsibility to make ethical choices is going to be somewhat diminished. And who's at fault in a particular situation or a particular act might be different versus someone who answers the question, are human choices freely made? If they answer the question, yes, they are, and yes, we are responsible, then all of a sudden ethics takes on a much more, it can be seen from a much more powerful light that way. Same thing goes with epistemology and so forth. The assumptions that you make, the decisions that you make in the field of metaphysics, the field of epistemology, that is going to determine, in large part, how you approach ethics. Okay. So let's sort of dive right in. Now, whenever we are looking at, whenever we're considering evaluating an action that somebody does, whether it's helping a little old lady across the street or whether it's pushing her in front of the bus, we would usually look at one of probably 4 different categories in order to evaluate evaluate that action. The first category that we might look at, and that these ethical theories will concern themselves with, is that of our character. Okay, the character. And if you think about a person's character, what is a character? What does that mean? And we're not talking about like a character in a comic book or something like that. But what does it mean when we say a person has good character or a person has bad character? Basically, your character is an internal, settled internal ethical disposition from which you make ethical choices. It's a settled disposition, internal disposition from which you make ethical choices. Usually, people act in a manner that is consistent with their character. If a person, we've all known of situations where somebody has done something that didn't seem like them, right? It didn't seem like that was normal for them. And we would say that person is acting out of character. Maybe it's a person that we've always known to be honest, who we've heard about telling a lie. And we would say that person that person was not acting according to their character. They were out of character when they did that. Well, we know that our character governs a good majority of our ethical decisions. Typically without even thinking about it. It's sort of a subliminal thing. Our character can affect things that way. On the other hand, there are motives. Now, this again is still something that's internal, but motives differ from character specifically in that motives apply to particular things that we do, particular actions that we take, and so forth. So a motive may apply to the immediate act as opposed to a character, which might govern several different acts. Acting in accordance with our character, we do. We normally live our life in this sort of thing, but our motive for an individual act might be something that's entirely different. So a motive is basically is an internal motivation for doing an action. And some ethical theories will look at the motive of the act to determine whether or not it was a good act. Now, I mean, because let's face it, we've all tried to do good things from time to time and that messed up entirely. And we've known people that have done that as well. We've known people who have tried to do good things maybe for us or to us, and they messed up, and it's like, oh, well, it was the thought that counts, right? That's the idea. We're not judging that person based on the messed up situation that we're in now. Maybe our child brings breakfast to us in bed and spills the orange juice all over our comforter or whatever. So the action itself was flawed, but we don't berate and yell at our child because we know that they are motivated out of love for us. We know we've got a job to do to get things cleaned up, but we are thankful that our child took the time to think about us, even if what they tried to do, or, didn't go through exactly as planned. And so we would judge that act not on the basis of their clumsiness, but on the basis of their motive. So that's another quality of an act that sometimes we will look at. In addition to character and motive, there's also the action itself that some theories will look at, and they will say that doing this action is doing this action itself is that's a good thing or that's a bad thing. In other words, these are rule following ethical theories, right? So things that would tell us, for example, thou shalt not lie. Well, I can think of a situation where maybe lying might be a good thing. If I'm in Germany in 1942 and I'm hiding Jewish people in my basement so that I can help them get out of the country and avoid extermination, and the Nazis come knocking on the door and demanding that I give up the Jewish people in my house, or asking me if I'm hiding Jews in my house, I can see that lying to them might be justified. They are, after all, the scum of the earth, right? So it would not be, there may be situations where lying might be justified, but those theories that look at the act in and of itself may disagree. They may say, you know what, it's never right to lie. Now, you don't have to tell them that you have the Jews there, but you don't have to lie about it either, that lying is never justified, it's never right. In other words, some views will look at the act itself and judge certain acts as always good, other acts as always bad. So we've got character, we've got motives, we've got actions, and then there are the consequences. There are those theories that judge the act on the basis of the consequence that the act produces. These are called consequentialist ethics. And basically the idea there is that the idea behind this is that everything that we've seen so far, whether it's character or motive or action, to try to base our judgment on whether or not an act is good based on those things is something that we cannot comprehend, they would say. For example, what does it mean that a person has a particular character? That doesn't mean that they can't do bad things. I mean, we all admit to that, right? That the person can act out of character and do bad things. And when a good person does a bad thing, that doesn't make the action good. So what is this character? It's something that we can't really wrap our heads or hands around. And they'll say, look, at the same thing with motives. And how can you ever know what truly motivates a person to do something, to do what they did, unless they tell you? But even then, it may not be entirely true, because they may be lying to themselves about what motivated them, or they might be lying to you about what motivated them. So we really can never judge an act. That's not a good basis to judge the act on, because we can't tell someone's motive. Well, the action itself, what about an action makes it good or bad? There really is nothing. So the only thing that we have to go by, says the consequentialist, are the effects that the act produces. That's all we have to go by. The effects that the act produces. That's something that we can see. That's something that we can measure. That's something we can sort of wrap our heads and hands around. And so the consequences are what we need to base that on. So we will look at various theories that attempt to look at the character, the motive, the action, and the consequences in order to judge the moral worth of a particular act. So let's talk a little bit about a survey of the field of ethics. So the entire field of ethics can be divided in half based on how an ethical theory answers this question. And the question is this: are there such things as universal moral principles? Are there such things as universal moral principles? Now, what is a universal moral principle? A universal moral principle is a moral principle that applies to everyone of all places, regardless of culture, regardless of ethnicity, regardless of language, regardless of place and point in history. Are there moral principles that apply to everyone universally? Now, if you answer that question, yes, and you only really need one universal moral principle to say yes, but if there's one, at least one universal moral principle, then you find yourself on the side of objectivist ethics. Objectivist ethics says, yes, there is at least one universal moral principle that applies to all people of all times, everywhere, and so forth. Now, on the other hand, if you answer that no, there are no such thing as universal moral principles. Either moral principles are individually decided or they're culturally decided. Then you find yourself on the side of ethics that says that is known as subjective ethics. Subjective ethics, or relativism as it's often called, says that there are no such thing as universal moral principles. There are no such things as universal moral principles. So that's the two fields that we'll look at. There is one theory that kind of tries to bridge those, and we'll look at that later on. But those are basically the two sides. So what I'd like to do is take a look at a couple of versions of relativism first. Relativism or subjective ethics. Remember, this side says no, there's no such thing as universal moral principles. The universe is not made up in such a way that it is a moral place. Excuse me. So there are no such things as universal moral principles. But then relativism has to deal with the question, well, why then does everybody appear to be moral or motivated by morality? I mean, from our very earliest days, it seems like we are all the time saying that's bad. You know, even if we're a little baby and somebody takes our bottle or takes our sucker, we look at them as if they've wronged us, as if they've done something wrong, right? That in and of itself is a very simplistic moral judgment. So, what is it about the reality? If there are no such thing as universal moral principles, why does everybody seem to have some sort of moral code? Well, they answer this two ways. The first one is known as subjective ethical relativism. Subjective ethical relativism. And subjective ethical relativism says this. It says that morals are a matter of personal opinion, and that's it. So instead of saying such and such is good and such is bad, what you're really saying is I approve of such and I disapprove of such and such. Morals are just an expression of what things you like and what you don't like. Perhaps one of the most famous philosophers here, a famous philosopher here, is a gentleman by the name of David Hume. And David Hume basically says, look, if there are such things as moral principles, then they would apply to everybody and everything, every creature, every sentient being. But he says that just isn't the case. Because think about this. He asked the question, is incest wrong? And of course, growing up, or living as he did, sort of in the Victorian era, of course, everybody's aghast. Well, of course, it's wrong. It's terrible. Incest is a horrible thing. And he says, well, okay, why don't we get upset then when animals do incest, like dogs, when dogs commit incest? We don't care about that. We don't look at them as if they've done some sort of moral wrong. And here's the thing. If morality is morality, then it's moral for everybody or immoral for everybody and everything. This is just an explanation, he would say, of how we treat morality. It's just something that we approve of and something we don't approve of. That is ethical or subjective ethical relativism. But if we took this view seriously, could we possibly take this view seriously? Think about this. How would we live? What would have to change if we took this view seriously? Because aren't laws in some way simply a matter of imposing a system of morality on someone. For example, when we say you should only do 35 miles an hour in this road, why are we saying that? Well, there is a moral undergirding to the speed limit laws. The speed limit laws presuppose that that human life is worth protecting and worth preserving. That's a moral assumption. Speed limit laws assume that orderly moving of transportation is a good thing for society. That's a moral assumption. And speed limit laws are designed to try to produce both of those things: protecting, preserving human life, enabling transportation, and so forth. And so isn't that a case? What would we do if everything was subjective? We would just have to get rid of speed limit laws. We'd have to get rid of all laws, and we'd end up in a place that philosopher Thomas Hobbes calls the war of all against all. We'll talk about him more later. But it would be a terrible place if everybody just did what they wanted to do. There would be no governing. There would be no civilization. There'd be no art, no communication. It'd be a terrible place to live in. The problem with subjective ethical relativism is that if we take it to its logical conclusion, it's very difficult to see how such a philosophy would provide a basis for a justice system or a legal system, or even just common human interactions, even things like marriage or relationships and things like that. But that is one view. Now, another view that's related to that comes from people who don't believe in the existence of universal moral principles, but they believe that even though there are no such things as universal moral principles, we still need, just as a way of practical solution, we still need a way of interacting in society together so that we don't kill each other. We're not at each other's throats all the time. And so this view is known as conventional ethical relativism. Conventional ethical relativism. Now, conventional ethical relativism says that we arrive at our ideas of morality based on the culture that we live in, and that moral principles flow directly out of the culture that we live in. Conventional relativism says that morals are an outworking of one's own culture, so that certain actions are good in some cultures that might not be good in others. For example, how women are treated in reference to their freedom and amount of freedom differs from the United States in, let's say, someplace like Afghanistan, especially early 2000s. They're very significantly different how women are treated. Now the question is the way that the United States treats women, is that superior? Is that better than that of Afghanistan, where women many times are not even allowed to walk out of the house without a male escort? They have to have every square inch of their body covered. They cannot have property. They cannot own driver's license. They cannot go driving around in public. If they violate these laws, they can be publicly whipped, basically like drug out into the square and beaten. So is it better to treat women like we do in the U.S., or is it better to treat women like they do in Afghanistan? And so we do recognize one thing, even without making moral judgment on that. We do recognize one thing, that the way that they're treated are different, and that the way that each respective culture believes they should be treated, that is different as well. So which one is right? But that's conventional ethical relativism, the idea that morals come from your culture, that every society has different moral values, and that that whether or not an act is wrong or right depends on the culture, the society in which it takes place. Excuse me. There are some significant critiques to this theory. we do. I mean, let's face it. We can look around and see that the cultures around the world differ very widely from one another. We can see that just readily, especially for those who have been overseas and seen how things go and and this sort of thing. We can see that the cultures vary tremendously in the different moral norms that they approve of. There's a philosopher whose name was James Rachels who commented on this, though. He gave his evaluation of conventional ethical relativism. And basically his critique says this. He says, he was not a conventionalist, by the way. He was not an ethical relativist. He says this. He says, as we look around in different cultures, we do see the fact that the different moral practices take place. However, those moral practices, if you get down underneath them and you see what the foundation of those moral practices are, what we find is that every society really recognizes a common set of core morality. And they're core moral assumptions that if a society doesn't recognize these things, it will not flourish. It'll collapse and die. So the end of civilization for that society. Things like respect of human life. Could you imagine a society where respect of human life at some level was not honored? What effect would that have? Well, everybody would be running around looking over their shoulder wondering who's going to kill them. Well, it'd be like the purge, right? You'd always be constantly on the lookout of who's going to do you in, who's going to do you in. Here's the thing about the purge, and here's the thing about that sort of scenario. There's a lot of things that can't take place there. For example, how are you going to raise a family in that? It could be one of your own children that does you in if they don't have a respect for human life. How are you going to have any sort of relationship? Because it could be your spouse that doesn't have respect for human life, and they might be the one that does you in. It could be, how are you going to have a job to go to? Because again, you're always looking over your shoulder, worrying about who's going to kill you. So a lot of things that are possible in our culture and in our society are only possible because as a society we have a level of respect for human life. I don't walk down the road most of the time assuming that everybody's going to kill me or hurt me or harm me or steal something from me. So respect for human life is one. Another one is just basically that we value truth telling. That doesn't mean nobody ever lies. And that doesn't mean that there aren't just grotesque liars in our society. What it does mean, though, is that we value truth. And the way that we can see that is because think about the things that would not be possible if we did not value truth-telling. If we did not value truth-telling and we just thought that 50% of whatever comes out of somebody's mouth is going to be a lie and we don't know which one it is, what's a lie and what's truth, would we ever bother listening to people? I mean, think about it. If you've known somebody who has an issue with lying, what's it like to talk to that person? It's a headache to get any real information because you can't know that what they're going to say is actually true. And so it just really befuddles you eventually to the point where either you give up talking to them altogether or you just sit around with a smirk on your face and listening to the line that they're trying to feed you. Thinking, do they really expect me to be that stupid this time, right? So a lie, respect for truth-telling rather, is something that we have to have in our culture in order to even communicate. We're communicating now. I'm talking and you're listening, and I'm conveying information. The assumption that you are making at this moment is that I'm telling you what I believe to be true. I may be mistaken. I may be wrong. But the assumption is, it's a good faith assumption that says, well, he has no reason to lie to me. He's going to tell the truth. If we don't have a common moral standard of a core morality is what Rachel's calls it, then our society would not exist. Think of if we don't have communication, things would not exist. We couldn't have education. We couldn't have art. We couldn't have technology. We couldn't have music. We couldn't have any of that without communication. And so just those two things enable civilization to live. And if every civilization doesn't have a respect for those common moral values, or if a civilization rather doesn't have respect for those, it collapses. It goes bye-bye. It goes extinct. Which is why Rachel says, look, if that's the case, if there is a core morality, then that argues for the error of relativism. Because if there are core moral values that every society has to recognize, that means that at some level there is an objective, universal moral principle to some degree that all of them have to recognize or they die. A society that tries to live without recognizing this core morality would be like a person who tried to live without breathing. It simply cannot be done. These things are foundational to civilization. So the conventional ethical relativism, Rachel's would say that critique alone is really enough to really question the validity of that, of conventional relativism. There are some other problems too. I mentioned earlier, to give you an example, the treatment of people, of women in the U.S. versus the treatment of women in Afghanistan. If you think about this, how they're treated differently, I asked the question of which one is better. Now, before we even get to that question, understand that in order to be able to answer that question, you have to have a standard of morality that overarches both the culture of the United States and the culture of Afghanistan. If, as conventional relativism says, if the only standard that you can possibly judge by exists solely within that culture, then according to conventional relativism, you don't have an overarching standard and you can't make a judgment about which one is better. The only thing that you could say is that it's different. We do it differently here than they do it there. If we find ourselves making judgments on the practices of other cultures, we have moved out of the camp of conventional ethical relativists, and we are claiming an objective standard somewhere. But those are excuse me, the two relativist answers to the question of are ethics subjective or objective? Are there such things as objective universal moral principles? If you answer no, those are the two: subjective ethical relativism and conventional ethical relativism. Now, on the other side of the chasm, as it were, the other side of the sheet or the ledger, whatever you want to say, if you answer yes to that question, are there universal moral principles in the universe? If you answer yes, there's at least one, and really there only has to be one. There can be many subjective principles, but if there's one universal, that means you're on the side of ethical objectivism. If you answer yes to that question, you are on the side of objectivist ethics.